What if I told you that everything you know about Medusa is a lie? What if the monster with snakes for hair wasn't just another victim in Greek mythology, but actually the catalyst for a war so devastating that the gods themselves erased it from history? In the ancient ruins beneath the Aegean Sea, archaeologists recently discovered tablets that tell a completely different story. A story about Medusa that connects her not to Perseus and his heroic quest, but to something far older, far darker, and far more catastrophic. A forgotten war between Olympus and the Titans that nearly destroyed the world. And the most shocking part? Medusa wasn't the villain. She was the weapon. Before we dive into this untold chapter of mythology, you need to understand something crucial about ancient Greek religion. The stories we know today, the ones written by Homer and Hesiod, weren't the original versions. They were propaganda, the victors writing history. And like all victors, they had things to hide. The gods of Olympus, led by Zeus, overthrew the Titans in a war called the Titanomachy. We're told this war ended with Zeus's victory, the Titans imprisoned in Tartarus, and peace restored to the cosmos. But that's not where the story ends. That's where the cover-up begins. A time before Perseus, before the hero myths, to an era when the Olympians were still consolidating their power. The Titans had been defeated, yes, but they weren't destroyed. And deep in the prisons of Tartarus, they were plotting their return. The key to understanding this forgotten war lies in understanding what Medusa really was. Not who she was, but what she was. Because according to these newly discovered texts, Medusa wasn't born human. She wasn't transformed by Athena as punishment. That's the sanitized version, the story they told later to make sense of what they'd done. The truth is far stranger. Medusa was created, deliberately, intentionally, as a living weapon in a war that the gods desperately needed to win. But to understand why they created her, we need to go back even further, to the moment when the Olympian gods realized they had a problem that threatened everything they'd fought for. You see, when Zeus and his siblings defeated the Titans, they made a critical error. They assumed that raw power was enough to maintain control. They threw the Titans into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, and thought that would be the end of it. But they underestimated one crucial thing. The Titans weren't just powerful. They were primordial. They were tied to the fundamental forces of the universe in ways that the younger Olympian gods were not. Kremlin, Pazos, the father of Zeus, wasn't just a Titan. He was the embodiment of time itself. Oceanus wasn't just powerful, he was the ocean. Hyperion wasn't just bright, he was light itself made conscious. These weren't beings you could simply lock away and forget about. They were woven into the fabric of reality. And in Tartarus, they discovered something the Olympians hadn't anticipated. They discovered that their primal connection to the universe could be weaponized. They learned to reach beyond their prison, to touch the world above, to corrupt and twist the very foundations of existence. And they began to do exactly that. The first signs were subtle. Earthquakes that couldn't be explained. Tides that moved against the pull of the moon. Crops that withered for no reason. Time itself seemed to become unreliable. Days would stretch impossibly long or compress into moments. The Olympians tried to ignore it at first. They told themselves it was just aftershocks from the war, residual chaos settling down. But it got worse, much worse. Animals began to mutate, their forms twisting into nightmarish shapes. Humans started to go mad, their minds unable to cope with the reality that was beginning to fracture around them. And then, the monsters came. Not the monsters we know from mythology. These were different. These were creatures that seemed to exist in multiple states at once, things that broke the laws of nature just by being. The Olympians realized they were facing something unprecedented. The Titans were attacking reality itself from their prison. unmaking the world the gods had claimed. And conventional warfare couldn't stop it. You can't fight an enemy that attacks the concept of existence. Zeus called a council. Every god, every goddess, every divine being that had sided with Olympus was summoned. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast, because the world was literally coming apart at the seams. Hoffman, who proposed the unthinkable. To fight primordial power, they needed primordial power of their own. They needed to create something that could counteract the Titans' reality-warping abilities. Something that could literally freeze existence in place, lock it down, make it solid and immutable. They needed to create a being whose very gaze could turn the flow of chaos into stone. They needed to create MEDUSA. But creating such a being wasn't simple. It required sacrifice. It required breaking rules that even gods weren't supposed to break. It required going to places that existed before the gods, before the Titans, before anything that could be called order or chaos. They went to the primordial void, to the space between existence and non-existence where the first beings had emerged. There, they found the Gorgon sisters, ancient entities that predated even the Titans. Stheno and Euryale, beings of pure primal terror, guardians of the threshold between reality and the void. The gods made a deal. They would take one of the Gorgon sisters and transform her, reshape her, weaponize her. In return, they would grant the Gorgons power in the world above, dominion over their own realm. The Gorgons agreed, but there was a condition. The transformation would require a mortal component. The weapon they were creating couldn't be purely divine, or it would be bound by the same rules that limited the gods. It needed to be partially mortal, partially human, so it could exist outside divine law. They chose a young woman, a priestess of Athena named Medusa, beautiful, devout, innocent, the perfect sacrifice. What happened next was so horrific that the gods who witnessed it never spoke of it again. They didn't transform Medusa, they unmade her. They took her apart at the level of fundamental existence and rebuilt her into something new, something that was part human, part Gorgon, part divine curse. They wove into her very being the power to stop time, to freeze motion, to turn the fluid chaos of reality into solid, unchanging stone. Her hair became serpents, living conduits of the paralyzing power. Her eyes became windows to the void, portals to the space between existence where nothing could move or change. When they were done, Medusa was no longer human. She was barely a person at all. She was a weapon with consciousness, a living embodiment of stasis and death. And she was completely, utterly alone. The gods didn't tell her what she was. They didn't explain what they'd done to her or why. They simply gave her a mission. Go to Tartarus, find the points where the Titans were reaching through to touch the world, and turn those connections to stone. Freeze their power in place. Stop them from unmaking reality. Medusa did as she was commanded, because what else could she do? She descended into Tartarus, into the deepest darkness, where the Titans raged against their imprisonment. And there, she became the gods' secret weapon in a war that history forgot. The Titans, in their arrogance, didn't see her coming. They were so focused on their grand plan to unmake reality that they didn't notice the small figure approaching their prison. They didn't understand what she was until it was too late. When Medusa looked upon the first tendril of Titan power reaching up from Tartarus, it froze, literally froze, turned to stone, becoming inert and harmless. The Titans felt it immediately. A sudden absence, a connection severed, a part of their power locked away forever. They tried to pull back, but Medusa was relentless. She moved through Tartarus like death itself, her gaze falling upon every crack, every weak point, every place where the Titans had pushed through their prison walls. And everywhere she looked, stone. Solid, immutable, unchanging stone. The Titans panicked. This wasn't something they had prepared for. This wasn't raw power they could fight against. This was something else entirely. This was their own primal nature being used against them, twisted into a weapon that negated their very existence. They tried to fight back. Kronos himself reached out with his power over time, trying to age Medusa into dust, trying to rewind her to before she existed. But her eyes met his power, and time itself turned to stone, frozen, stopped, locked in a single eternal moment. Oceanus tried to drown her with primordial waters, the chaos from which all seas were born. But the water met her gaze and became crystal, solid, immobile. Williams, disillusion. One by one, the Titans threw everything they had at this impossible creature that the gods had created, and one by one, their attacks turned to stone. The war raged in the depths of Tartarus, unknown to the mortals above, barely whispered about even among the gods. It was brutal, it was desperate, and it was utterly one-sided. Because Medusa wasn't fighting them. She wasn't attacking or defending. She was simply looking. And wherever she looked, the Titan's power died. It took 7 years. 7 years of Medusa alone in the darkness, surrounded by the rage and terror of the most powerful beings in existence, systematically turning their power to stone. Semble. 7 years of the gods waiting above, watching the signs in the world, seeing the chaos slowly subside as their weapon did its work. 7 years of Medusa losing more and more of her humanity, becoming more monster than woman, more weapon than person. When it was finally over, when the last of the Titans' connections to the world above had been petrified, when Tartarus was sealed so completely that not even a whisper of primordial power could escape, the gods breathed a sigh of relief. The world was saved. Reality was secure. The Olympian order would continue, and they immediately set about making sure no one would ever know the truth. SHTMing. They couldn't destroy Medusa. She was too powerful for that, too fundamentally connected to the primal forces they'd used to create her. But they could exile her. They banished her to a remote island at the edge of the world, a place where no one would find her, where she could live out her existence in isolation. They told her it was a reward, a place to rest after her service. But it was a prison. A comfortable prison, perhaps, but a prison nonetheless. And then they rewrote the story. They created the myth we all know. The beautiful priestess violated in Athena's temple, the goddess's curse, the monster that turned men to stone. They made Medusa the villain, the creature to be feared, the thing that heroes needed to slay. Why? Because the truth was too dangerous. If people knew that the gods had created Medusa, that they had sacrificed a young woman and transformed her into a weapon, it would raise uncomfortable questions. If people knew there had been a second war with the Titans, a war that the gods nearly lost, it would undermine their authority. If people knew that the gods were willing to break fundamental laws of existence to maintain their power, it would shatter the illusion of divine order. So they lied. They created a false narrative, and they made sure that anyone who knew the truth would never tell it. The Gorgon sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were bound by divine oath to never speak of what had been done to their sister. The gods who participated in Medusa's creation were sworn to secrecy. And Medusa herself was isolated, alone, unable to tell her story to anyone because her very appearance would turn them to stone before she could speak. For centuries, she lived on that island, completely alone. The gods occasionally sent people to check on her to make sure she was still contained. Mostly, they sent people they wanted to get rid of. Criminals, troublemakers, people who asked too many questions. Those people never came back, of course. Medusa would see them approaching, and her instinct, her nature, would take over. Stone. More and more statues littering her island, silent witnesses to her lonely existence. And slowly, ever so slowly, the truth faded into obscurity. The war was forgotten. Medusa's true purpose was lost. She became nothing more than a monster in a story, a cautionary tale, a challenge for heroes to overcome. Plumbing. Until Perseus. Now, let's talk about Perseus, because his part in this story is more complicated than the myths suggest. Perseus wasn't just a random hero who decided to slay a monster. He was sent, deliberately, by the gods, specifically by Zeus, who had his own reasons for wanting Medusa dead. You see, something had changed. After all those centuries of isolation, Medusa had started to remember. Not just remember, but understand. Understand what had been done to her. Understand what she really was. Understand the power she wielded. And more importantly, she started to realize that if she could turn Titan power to stone, she could turn divine power to stone too. The gods began to fear their own weapon. Athena especially. Athena, who had been the one to choose Medusa in the first place, who had overseen her transformation, who carried the guilt of that choice. Athena began to have nightmares of Medusa returning to Olympus, of those terrible eyes looking upon the gods themselves, of the entire divine order turning to stone, just as the Titan power had. So when Perseus needed an impossible task to prove himself, when he needed to bring back the head of a monster to save his mother, the gods saw an opportunity. They would help him. They would guide him. They would give him the tools he needed. Not because they cared about Perseus or his mother, but because they needed Medusa dead. And they needed her head. Even dead, Medusa's power would be useful. The ability to turn things to stone, to freeze them in place, to stop chaos. That was too valuable to waste. So Perseus was given a mission disguised as a heroic quest. He was told the story of the monster Medusa, the creature whose gaze turned men to stone. He was not told about the forgotten war. He was not told about Medusa's true origin. He was definitely not told that he was being used to eliminate a threat to the gods themselves. Perseus went to Medusa's island, with Athena's mirror shield, with Hermes's winged sandals, with Hades's helm of invisibility, with every divine advantage that could be given, and he killed Medusa, decapitated her while she slept, because even with all his divine gifts, he couldn't face her directly. Medusa died, never knowing that her death was ordered by the same gods she had served, never knowing that the war she had fought and won was being erased from history, never knowing that her sacrifice had saved the world, only to be remembered as a monster. Perseus took her head back to the gods, and Athena, with a mixture of relief and guilt that she would never acknowledge, placed it on her shield, the Aegis. Even in death, Medusa would serve. Her head, her power, her terrible gaze would protect the goddess who had damned her. And there it remained for centuries, a constant reminder on Athena's shield, but also a secret, because everyone who looked at that shield saw only a trophy, a symbol of triumph over chaos and monstrosity. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the woman who had been sacrificed. They didn't see the warrior who had fought alone in the darkness to save a world that would never thank her. They didn't see the victim of divine pragmatism and political necessity. The forgotten war remained forgotten. The Titans stayed locked in their prison, their power turned to stone, unable to touch the world above. The gods maintained their rule, their authority unchallenged, and Medusa became a story, a cautionary tale about beauty and pride, a monster in myths, a name that meant horror and petrification, everything but the truth. But here's the thing about truth. It has a way of surviving, even when it's buried, even when it's erased, even when the gods themselves want it forgotten. Those tablets found beneath the Aegean Sea, they weren't alone. Archaeologists have been finding fragments, pieces of the real story scattered across the Mediterranean. A temple wall in Crete showing Medusa descending into Tartarus. A pottery shard from Sicily depicting her facing the Titans. A relief in Turkey showing the gods creating her, the terror and guilt visible on their divine faces. The evidence is there. The truth is emerging. And it changes everything we thought we knew about Greek mythology. Because if the gods lied about Medusa, what else did they lie about? What other wars were forgotten? What other victims were transformed into villains? What other truths were buried beneath layers of propaganda and heroic narrative? The forgotten war that shook Olympus and the Titans wasn't forgotten by accident. It was deliberately erased. And Medusa's story wasn't distorted by chance. It was carefully rewritten to hide an uncomfortable truth, that the gods we worship, the heroes we celebrate, were built on sacrifice and lies. That power, whether divine or mortal, always comes with a cost. And that cost is usually paid by those who have no choice in the matter. Gmail had no choice. She was chosen, transformed, weaponized, used, and then discarded. And when her story was told, she wasn't even allowed to be the hero of her own tragedy. She was made the monster, the villain, the thing that needed to be destroyed. But now we know better. Now we can see past the lies to the truth beneath. Medusa wasn't a monster. She was a victim who became a warrior. She wasn't a curse. She was a weapon, forged in desperation to save the world. She wasn't evil. She was just alone, utterly, completely, devastatingly alone. And perhaps that's the real horror of her story. Not the snakes, not the petrifying gaze, not even the transformation itself. The real horror is that she saved the world, and the world forgot her. She fought a war that would have destroyed everything, and history erased it. She sacrificed her humanity, her life, her very existence, and all she got in return was to be remembered as a monster. The tablets beneath the Aegean Sea tell us one more thing. One final detail that makes this entire story even more tragic. When Perseus killed Medusa, when he severed her head from her body, she was crying. Not tears of pain or fear, tears of relief. Because after centuries of isolation, centuries of being a weapon, centuries of being feared and hated and alone, death was finally an escape. The gods had taken everything from her, her humanity, her life, her future, her story. The only thing they couldn't take was her death. And in the end, that was the only freedom she had left. The forgotten war that shook Olympus and the Titans ended not with the imprisonment of the Titans, but with the death of the weapon that had defeated them. A woman named Medusa, who was transformed into a monster, who fought alone in the darkness, who saved the world, and who was thanked with exile, vilification, and ultimately, death. Misinformation. Her head still sits on Athena's shield, still turning threats to stone, still protecting the gods, still serving, even in death. But now, finally, we can see it for what it really is. Not a trophy, not a symbol of heroic triumph, but a memorial, a reminder of what the gods were willing to do to maintain their power, a testament to the forgotten war, and the forgotten hero who won it. The next time you see an image of Medusa, the next time you hear her story told as a tale of monsters and heroes, remember the truth. Remember the war that was erased from history. Remember the woman who was sacrificed to save the world. Remember that the gods aren't always the heroes, and the monsters aren't always the villains. Sometimes, the monster is just someone who was made into a weapon and then discarded when the war was over. Sometimes, the forgotten war is forgotten because the victors don't want you to remember what they did to win. And sometimes, the only way to honor the dead is to tell their true story, even when the gods themselves want it buried. Medusa's war is over, but her story, her real story, is just beginning to be told. And maybe, just maybe, that's a kind of justice. Not the justice she deserved in life, but the justice of truth finally coming to light. The justice of a forgotten hero finally being remembered. The justice of a name that means monster finally being understood as meaning something else entirely. Warrior, victim, survivor, hero, Medusa.